I looking at this here someplace. So we're looking at the far next time. If you want to get ahead, read Black Elk. Read Black Elk Speaks. Black Elk Speaks, I think that's the name of it, isn't it? Anyway, Black Elk is about American, Native American religion. And that'll take us to the next exam. And then, so we'll have an exam on Whitman, James Baldwin, Malcolm X, and Black Elk. And then the final will take us up through the last two books, Etruscan Places and what's the last one? The Chosen. So that's what you can look forward to. You can time yourself accordingly. If you want to read ahead, you can do that too.
So when are we going to have the test?
Well, how do I know? I just told you what the order is. I basically told you that just watch the rest of the book. That's all I know. We're going to have the tests in thunderclap evening. You watch how we move on the books and you'll get it. I just told you what the progression is. As we get close up, there'll be a test coming on. You can smell the progress, I think, right? Sorry to be, if you guys think I'm a genius that I have a date in my mind, I have no idea how long it takes to get through a given subject. So as we get through, we'll do it. That's how I'm envisioning. Maybe I shouldn't have told you that, because then you wouldn't have been, maybe you wouldn't have been questioned. I think you got quite a while, frankly. If I were to estimate, I think you got quite a while. A couple of weeks, I think. That's where we stand. Any other issues? You got an attendance sheet to throw around? Yeah, maybe pass around, because these latecomers are beginning to be, I think they should be penalized. All the people get here on time should be given their proper due. So I think we should get this attendance sheet around quickly. The reason I don't call the attendance is because it's about 100 some odd names, and it takes about 10 minutes to call, so it really is a waste of your class time. All right, now, Baldwin is a very highly regarded Afro-American writer. As you see, the books he's written in the introduction here. He was probably the most famous black, if you can use that term. I don't particularly like color terms, but I don't think anyone is black, brown, blue, or any other color, frankly. It's, everyone's a mixture of colors, it seems to me. These terms come and go. When I was young, it was considered polite to call different people of different backgrounds colored. Then that became looked upon negatively by another group in the next decades or so, and they thought that was running away from some sort of consciousness of some kind. So they insisted on following, I think, French ideas of a book that was written by North Africa, I think, called Negritude. Negro became in for a while, then that went out. Then black came in. Now black is going out in favor of Afro-American and so on. And now colored is coming back, people of color. It's so weird the way these things move. I don't understand what the issue is. Why do we have to speak about color in this case? I think Afro-American is probably the most appropriate designation, just like you call somebody Hispanic American or Polish American or Irish American or something like that. I think that obviously gets away from color codes. I don't know how you guys feel, or Asian American or Chinese American or some other kind of group. Seems to me that's the fairest designation. But, I don't know. there was a group that came along in the 60s when things were moving in all different directions that picked up on the French idea of negritude and started the new black is beautiful sort of thing. But in the Afro-American community, I think there's people of every different sort of color, if you want to call it that. So I don't think one color is appropriate in designating any particular group. It's more a cultural background. So I'm not an expert on these things, but I always thought that different colors were the wrong way to try to refer to something. In any case, Afro-American seems to be one of the most popular current terminologies. People who have some African background, like for instance the new senator from Illinois, Obama, I think his name is, isn't it? And his father is from Africa, Kenya, I think. But you see now, his mother is Anglo, if you want to use that term, whatever that means, background. So, I mean, what should he be called? Why should he be called Afro-American any more than Anglo-American? I don't understand why one parent determines who and what you are, or how you're designated. It seems ridiculous to me. I don't know what the answer to these questions are, but they're worth thinking about. Why is Obama an Afro-American and then not an Anglo-American? Just on the basis of appearance? Is that what it all comes down to? So, in any case, these are things that are somewhat difficult, but Afro-American now seems to be widespread use. So Baldwin was, in his day, perhaps one of the most famous Afro-American writers after Richard Wright. He was considered Baldwin, Richard Wright, as you may know, was another one who preceded him, who went to Europe in exile. It turned out that many Afro-American writers found Paris more congenial than America for a long period of time. I think that's over with now. Paris is now not a city, not because of the Middle East crisis, that is so beautiful in terms of racial harmony. It is not a harmoniously racial city. There are huge suburbs where there are great problems in terms of people of North African and Central African descent, and a huge amount of racism in France, and all these imaginary ideas that you go to another world and it's free of these problems, I think are, to use a fancy word, I don't know if you know exactly what that means, a chimera. A chimera means an illusion. Chimera, C-H-I-M-E-R-A. So, for a time, Paris was the center of people who were seeking sanctuary. How did that happen? How did Paris become a sanctuary for people who were seeking acceptance, tolerance, and so on? Probably it goes back to the French Revolution, though I'm not sure that's the cause of it. But in the late 19th century, France was a kind of bohemian, or at least not the countryside of France, never was. Paris was a bohemian sort of mecca, if you want to call it that. And a lot of people were considered acceptable there. Plus, sexual mores have always been extremely advanced, shall we say, in France, even back in Thomas Jefferson's day, and Benjamin Franklin went to Paris. They saw a totally different world than when they went to London. You've seen recent movies or television docudramas on these people, you'll see the kind of life. Jefferson had a mistress in Paris and everything. He's reputed to have brought his Afro-American servant to Paris with him and started whatever alliance he supposedly had with her there. You know, Paris was very advanced in terms of relationship between the sexes, sexual liberation, which appealed to a lot of avant-garde and bohemian people. So that was in the 19th century, particularly 1800s, late 1800s. Plus, France had had a lot of relations with North Africa because of the conquests that they had undertaken in Morocco and Algeria. And a lot of North African culture had come into France, particularly the drug scene had come into France. If you're familiar with writing in the 19th century. How many have ever heard of the French poet Baudelaire? Well, he's the most famous French poet, I think. And you know, his poems are all about hashish and stuff like that they got from contact with North Africa, even at that time. And he's writing poems to his mistress, who is black, and he's praising her and so on. And this is in the mid 1800s, around the time of Abraham Lincoln, for instance, in America. So Paris was always very advanced in terms of those kinds of activities. And then, of course, you had all the painters in the late 19th century, and the Impressionists, and so it was always a mecca for people to go. Bohemians, Ernest Hemingway ended up there after World War I. A lot of American emigres went there after World War I, the sort of lost generation and so on. Well, what happened was, I think it started in World War I, when American soldiers went to France and encountered all this so-called new liberality, sexual, mainly sexual. In fact, Black Elk speaks about it to some extent in his book, because when you read Black Elk, you'll see that Black Elk, who was an American Sioux Indian shaman, really, medicine man, mystic, seer, visionary, who took part in Battle of the Little Bighorn and places and things like that. He was in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And well, Buffalo Bill, he describes in his book, Black Elk Speaks, going to Europe with Buffalo Bill and meeting Queen Victoria in England. But he also describes in Paris, he got sick, but he was obviously carrying on an affair with a French woman by that time, and was taken care of by this French woman. So even in Black Elk's time, which would have been in the 1870s or 1880s, Paris was very, very liberal. He wouldn't have been able to have an affair like that in London without repercussions of some kind. So Paris was extremely liberal. And another part of it had to do with the French colonial policy. You know, the English colonial policy and the French colonial policy was very, very different. For instance, you know, the English like to administer countries from a kind of class-conscious, snobbish level. And they like to set one community against the other. And therefore, wherever English people administered, like Iraq, for instance, later on they got into Iraq, but places like India, Cyprus, Kenya, all these kind of places, wherever they pulled out, terrible communal strife erupted after they left, because they had always put one minority against the other. So after they left, everyone started killing each other. Every place English had been, people had started killing each other afterwards. Even in Canada, you have the French versus the English up there, which was always very, very severe. Didn't end up killing each other much, but in places like Cyprus, the Greeks and the Turks, in India, the Muslims and the Hindus, in Kenya, and Canada, and all these kind of places, and all the Asians were thrown out of these places after the English left. So the English never did mix with the local population. What they did was set the local population against each other. When the French administered a place, they wanted to make little Frenchmen out of everybody. So you never find, when the French leave a place, that the people all start killing each other. All they want to do is go to Paris and be French. So France actually is inundated with people from African territorial background, like West Africa, the French colonies in West Africa, or, you know, Ivory Coast, or Chad, or Guinea, or these kind of places. I don't know if the Ivory Coast was French or not, but Guinea was, Chad, and all these other sort of places. Where the French Foreign Legion was supposed to be. Algeria is the only exception to some extent, but Algeria inundated France too now. So I think that was also part of it. The French believed in mixing of the races. So for instance, even in American movies, as you may know, from seeing Hollywood-type presentations, the French trappers were always mixing with the Native American people, marrying, having mistresses, you know, being, you know, going native, as it were. Unlike, to some extent, the Anglo-American trapper-type people, or the mountain men, if you want to call them that. So the French are always mixing everything in those terms. So it was natural that Paris was seen as a very tolerant center. So after World War I, when particularly Afro-American or black soldiers went over to Europe among the troops, they saw France as a very liberated place where they were concerned. So many stayed on, or, you know, had a great affection for Paris as a center. And that extended all the way up. World War I, you know, when you think about it, World War II is in the 1940s, as you know. World War I is in the 19-teens. But, you know, the time between World War I and World War II is only about 20, 25 years. You think, maybe that's how old many of you are, but if you think back 20, 25 years ago from today, that's only like 1985 or something. I mean, like, that's like yesterday. That's no time at all. 25 years is 1980. I mean, I think Ronald Reagan was coming into office at that time. That's almost like yesterday. So, you know, that period between World War I and World War II was a very short period. So the influence of World War I extended on even after World War II, I think. That's what I'm trying to say. Because that's why people like James Baldwin went back to France, if you want to go, and if you want to put it that way. And that's what I'm talking about. Spent their whole life, basically. But before we get into that, one of the most famous American persons of Afro-American descent, what was her name? The singer who was famous at the Folies Bergère in Paris and stayed on there.
Josephine Baker.
What was her name?
Josephine Baker.
Josephine Baker, right. You may have seen docudramas about her, or movies, or you may have even read books. I mean, how many have ever heard or seen of Josephine Baker? She was a really splendid looking person, and the French really reacted and responded to her tremendously positively, and she ended up being somewhat of a tragic figure, but for a long time, you know, she was a celebrated persona on the French stage between the two wars. And that came out of World War I. Later on, she got this big mansion in central France, and she had some trouble with husbands, different things like that. And coming back to America, she had problems, I think maybe because she was left-wing or whatever the problems were. But she ultimately started going over the deep end, adopting lots of children and stuff like that. And she had this chateau in southern France where she adopted children from all kinds of backgrounds. She must have had about 20, 25 different young children there that she had adopted. She wasn't like Michael Jackson in terms of supposedly molesting people, or whether he is or not, I have no idea. There was nothing like that ever rumored or anything like that. She was just wanted to protect people, but in doing this, her economic situation collapsed, and she lost everything. Thrown out of her chateau and became almost a beggar by the end of her life, poor thing. But she did do a lot of good, and she did, all the young people who she took in all remember her affectionately and dearly, and I think some of them did come to her rescue ultimately. But those stories often end tragically. But still, I mean, it's a really colorful story. So if you're interested, Josephine Baker is another interesting Afro-American, if you want to call it, refugee in Paris between the wars, being the First and Second World Wars, and after the Second World War. Then there was Richard Wright, who is the famous, first really well-known Afro-American novelist, and he writes about racism in America, and for some reason he felt he had to flee to Paris. And he hung around the cafes in Paris, particularly after World War II. Many black soldiers didn't come back from World War II. I was in Paris in the, I mean, that was just like, if you were intellectual, artistic, bohemian, we didn't have beatniks back then. We used to call people bohemians. If you were anything like that kind of person, you ended up in Paris at some point or other. And I met my wife in Paris, actually, and I saw all these people hanging around the cafes there, even in the late 50s when I went there, passed through there after I graduated college and stuff like that. And they were all on the left bank, as it was called. And I knew James Baldwin, bumped into him a few times. I didn't know him personally, talked to him, but exchanging word, or I've seen him in the different cafes and things. And people like that. Melvin Van Peebles was a close personal friend of mine back in those days. A movie maker. You would never have expected that he would become a celebrated movie maker and famous movie maker. I saw his first movie and it was terrible. But there you are. You never know what talents are going to come to the fore. He was a very clever manipulator and operator, though, and so it doesn't surprise me that he learned how to massage the system to his own advantage. That didn't surprise me. No, he was a close friend of mine back in those days. So I met a lot of these people when I went through there, and they were still there. And Baldwin had another aspect to his character. Of course, he was, I don't like to use the word gay as such, or homosexual. Again, it's a problem area that no word seems appropriate. I guess gay is the most acceptable usage these days. I don't know what the best usage would be. Anyway, his sexual orientation was towards people of the same sex, okay? Whatever word you want to apply to that, masculine or feminine, whatever is best for you. I mean, I don't even like the word lesbian, frankly. I don't think it seems to me pejorative in some way. But people, I saw a sign around the campus the other day, all lesbians come to this lesbian society meeting or whatever it was. Someone was going to talk or whatever, and so they didn't seem to mind using that word. So maybe it works fine, but to my mind, there must be better words than these. I don't know what the words are. In any case, he was very strong in that direction. And that is not very widespread among the African American community, at least as far as an overt thing and overtly acceptable thing in most societies. So that was another thing that, if you like, made him into an exile or alienated. So he started off his career in Harlem, and he writes about his early life here in Harlem. He was the son of a preacher. Many famous black intellectuals, Malcolm X, for instance, others are often sons of preachers. Martin Luther King, I mean, preachers are obviously within the Afro-American community some of the most sophisticated, educated people. Even, I think, Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson are supposedly preachers or reverends of some kind today, political figures. So it's fairly widespread in the Afro-American community that being the son of a preacher is, or being a preacher yourself is a person of some substance and influence. And I think in Baldwin's case, it certainly did rub off very, very strongly. But Baldwin, does he like his father? Those of you who are looking at this book here? No. No, he doesn't. He rather hates his father. Why does he hate his father? His father used to beat them. He used to come home and beat them and things like that. He hated his father. Plus his father, he considered his father to be a racist. He didn't like his father's racial attitudes. He thought his father was a bigot. His father was, was violent. Now, look, I'm not criticizing anyone's father, but many people have experienced the case of having violent fathers. I'm sure you all know something of what that means. And that's going to be the difference in when we read The Chosen. Because one of the things I think that strikes the students most about The Chosen is the tenderness of fathers to sons in that book. Not just one father, but two fathers to their sons. And it's a totally different environment. And I think it's surprising and not just shocking, but amazing to a lot of people to see such love and affection from a father poured on a son or one of their offspring in that manner. And it certainly does explain a lot of how the Jewish community manages to thrive in adversity. The non-violence of fathers to sons in the Jewish community and the tremendous love and affection lavished on sons by fathers is totally alien to a lot of people who think fathers are supposed to beat their sons. I think a lot of women in the classroom would respond positively to some husbands not beating sons and things. So this is the tremendous attraction of The Chosen novel for all people that I've had in my classes of all backgrounds. The total surprise of seeing a situation like that portrayed so tenderly and affectionately. So I just mention that in relation to the violence that James Baldwin writes about in his family. And D.H. Lawrence is another one whose father was pretty violent. And often these people with violent fathers dote on their mothers, become totally addicted to their mothers. Anyway, I don't have any answer to those things, but Baldwin doesn't like his father, but it's probably because of his the education he partially received from being a preacher's son that he was able to thrive. So he started writing here in America and ultimately went overseas and lived in the during the 60s and so on. I encountered him in the 50s there. Spent the rest of his life ultimately in Europe, had a European boyfriend whom he lived with, something like Josephine Baker in the countryside. He died not long ago, several years ago, but he never really did come back to America except briefly at times. And he felt more comfortable there. I think, as I was trying to say, I think this is over. I don't think people go to places like Paris anymore for tolerance, because I don't think you'll find it there. And there's a lot of really serious problems with the number of people from Black Africa, if you want to call it that, because we're talking about North Africa versus Central Africa. So you have Black Africa versus Arab North African immigrants from Africa in Paris. And a lot of it is violent. Extremely violent. There are areas in Paris that there are no-go areas, particularly in the outskirts of Paris and so on. Areas that I would consider as dangerous as a lot of areas in American cities, and there's a lot of violence and brutality that goes on there. French police have always been extremely violent and brutal. They're really almost fascist. They've always been. I was in Paris during the Algerian War. They all used to beat the living daylights out of people in the jails. Very, very. The problem in America always advertises all its dirty laundry for the whole world to see, but people don't know what goes on in other countries, and they idealize other countries and don't know it's probably as bad or worse in a lot of other countries. So I just I don't think you have exiles like James Baldwin much in Paris anymore. There seems to be more sanctuary here in America for a lot of people like that than in some of these other countries. England is a country also riven by racism, in case you're unaware of it. But they don't advertise it. They don't tell everyone what they're like. The problem with West Indian blacks, the problem with Pakistanis, the problem with other people from Southern Europe and England is extremely bad. And there's a lot of bloodshed and brutality and gang fighting and things like that that goes on in certain areas in English cities. Again, this is not advertised. America gets the rap for racism. America's one of the few countries that I think has tried to solve its racial problems, even as we saw with Whitman, fought a huge civil war and had a bloodletting where hundreds of thousands of people were killed. And there's very few countries that would have done that, actually. So, well, they should have. They caused this problem. No, I don't think they caused this problem. The Europeans unleashed this problem on the Americans through the slave trade. And that was done by European merchants of Portuguese, Spanish, English, and Dutch background. That was not done by Americans. That was already endemic here when the American country started to go. So the Europeans are totally involved in the issues that caused the Americans. Americans tried to sort their problems out with better or worse effects, in my personal view. So the Americans get a bum rap, and American people in this country are so busy criticizing this country that they give Europeans further impression that America is negative and bad, which is ridiculous. You don't find Europeans criticizing their countries the way Americans criticize this country. And Americans are just stupid the way they present themselves to other people. They immediately go and give them all of the worst things that they can imagine about this country, thinking this is going to ingratiate them with other people. All it does is reinforce their stereotypes. Reinforce the stereotypes in the Islamic world about America. Bin Laden stereotypes that you hear in his tapes and so on. All these things are totally inaccurate about the way America is. My wife, for instance, before she came to America, was full of these stereotypes that people in England had received concerning America. It was amazing at how different America was than the stereotypes that people have. So in any case, Americans, I can't do anything about this class, but Americans really do themselves a huge disservice the way they present themselves to other people, because they're totally unaware, because other people don't wash their dirty laundry in public, do not tell you about their problems, do not advertise the negative parts of their society for everybody to see. In fact, they are totally quiet about negative things within their society. And we are. Okay, so Baldwin is writing this book at a time when the civil rights movement has gotten going in America, isn't it? Who's he writing the book to?
Yes.
You're the only one who read this book. Don't you answer any more questions. We know you read. I want to hear what the other people. Do you other people work like this young lady's working? Or do you want me to do it all for you? Am I the exercise boy? Have I got to get on the bike and keep pedaling away here? Look, this chap's asleep over here. I thought my lectures are colorful enough to keep people awake, but it didn't seem to be doing good to him. I don't mind people sleeping. I used to fall asleep in all my classes at college, too. The classes I had at college, we didn't have carpets on the floor like you guys have. So I'd be sitting there, we'd have a room like this that was slanted, and we'd have a wooden sort of slat floor in this one lecture hall. And the minute I got into a class, I'd inevitably go to sleep. It was the air or something that was in this class with me. And my pencil would fall out of my hand, you see, or whatever, and it would go clatter, 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 kind of rolling down rolling down the floor. So it used to wake me up, but it also used to make it clear to everyone that was within the neighborhood that I had fallen asleep. I had a good class with an Asian specialist. He was an East Asian literature person, and we were doing Chinese literature and things in his class, and I'd fall asleep, and he would point me out and say, you see Eisenman over there? He's the perfect Taoist. He's going to get an A in this class. Because he's doing what every good Taoist would do, And I didn't get an A in his class, but the point is that he seemed to appreciate the fact that I was sleeping. So I'm not going to object to people sleeping, but I always try to keep people awake in terms of trying to make the class, at least the lectures, interesting enough that people would want to maybe, or would cause them to stay awake. I'm sorry if I put you to sleep. So, who's he writing this book to? His nephew, who's called what? James. Just like himself. And why is it his nephew? Because Baldwin is not a married sort of person, as I tried to imply to you, and is not going to have offspring, and is not going to have any children of his own. So it's his sister's child or his brother's child, I don't know which, brother's child, and he feels fatherly inclined towards this child. In the course of this outburst, which is what this book is, just a huge outburst of emotion, feeling, passion, elicited by the civil rights struggle in the late 50s and early 60s. He starts talking finally at some point about the black Muslims whom he encountered. Because he was so famous, Baldwin, as an Afro-American writer, that the black Muslims tried to recruit, that's the best word, tried to recruit him, absorb him, conciliate him, recruit him is the best word. And of course, any movement is trying to get people. I heard the other day on one of the TV shows that all the Hollywood actors that Kerry tried to recruit actually alienated people and didn't help him at all. In fact, it had the opposite effect on the rank and file of the American mass public, and I think that's probably true. All these fake actors and people don't do a lot of good for anybody. Just put people off that someone seems to need to be involved with such fools. Bruce Springsteen may have done a lot of music, but didn't probably carry as many votes as he lost him. So all that's very self-gratifying, and for the people who go to the concert, it's very exciting, but they forget the impression it's making on other people. So maybe people like politicians will learn that, in fact, it doesn't help them. It's usually the opposite. In the case of what happened a couple of days ago, that seems to be clear. But the black Muslims obviously felt the need to recruit James Baldwin for better or for worse, and they brought him to meet Elijah Muhammad. And he had shared certain platforms and radio programs with Malcolm X, and so on. But honestly, he obviously doesn't like Malcolm X. He has a negative view of Malcolm X. Aside from this propaganda movie that we just saw, extolling Malcolm X as the greatest hero since Mahatma Gandhi or something, Baldwin's view of him is quite different. And I frankly would probably more depend on Baldwin's view of the situation, much more intellectual, and he's certainly not someone who is conciliatory to the situation about the Afro-American condition. He's very angry, but he doesn't find that people like Elijah Muhammad, or particularly, I think he likes Elijah Muhammad better than Malcolm X from what I can see, are the way he wishes to go. Well, that's why I do this book, because I think we should have a balanced view of these things. And James Baldwin is really probably one of the most highly regarded and talented Afro-American intellectuals of the recent period. So I think it's good to get his view of these things too. I do think he, and again it's me, goes over the mark, but you have to also on certain things. But you have to understand that those times were very heady. People were involved in the civil rights movement, and there was a lot of demonstrations, agitations, things going on that were working everyone into an emotional fever pitch at that time. So he's really letting all his frustrations come out as well. But in the process, as he goes through it all, I think in the end you end up with a fairly balanced view after he's finished his catharsis. You know what a catharsis is? Letting out all your pent-up emotions. After he finishes that, I think he does come up with a fairly balanced view by the end, and a responsible program of how to proceed forward, unlike some of these other people. So let's try to look at what he says here. Prefaces, God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water the fire next time. That's a threat, of course. The Rainbow Coalition, to some extent, is taken out of that kind of a biblical allusion. That's not really the Bible, but it's from the Bible in the sense that the rainbow is interpreted in the Bible as a sign that God will not destroy the earth and so on. He reinterprets it here, and I guess that's the words of some aphorism out of the preaching background of church archaeology. I'm not sure where he gets that particular presentation. Dear James, page 3. I see in your face of your father, my brother, this dark, moody, vulnerable person. By the way, if someone wrote me something like this, I think it would depress me. I don't think that he's helping this young lad with this outpouring, and I'm not sure it was meant for the young lad, because I think for young people, the best thing is to just move ahead and take the world as it is and try to get on with making your situation in it as better as you can and without hurting people around you. So it doesn't help to tell someone all the barriers he's going to have to face before he, making him discouraged before he even gets started. I don't think that that's going to help him survive in a state of mental well-being. So, in my mind, it's better to encourage people rather than tell them all the negative things if that's what's coming out. Anyway, you're this kind of person, you like to look truculent because you don't want people to think you're soft. And then he talks about his father. You made me like your grandfather in this, so he kind of excuses his own father for being violent on the surface because he didn't want to look like he was soft. Now in the Chosen book, we're going to find people who are just the opposite, who are really quite willing to be totally soft and don't feel they have to be truculent at all, although one of the characters does behave a bit oddly with his son, as we'll see when we read that novel. But you and your father resemble him, our grandfather, my father, quite a lot. You want to close that door there because we seem to have a cacophony of human choruses coming out of that office there always. They seem to have a singing session going on there. I don't know if they ever do any work in that office, but they sure seem to have a lot of fun. Maybe we should all get a job in that office. We wouldn't have to suffer in the world. He's dead now. He never saw you. He had a terrible life. He was defeated long. Yeah, this is a great way to begin. He had a terrible life. He was defeated long before he died. And this is the reason Baldwin said, because he really believed what white people said about him. I have to tell you that I was brought up by, I don't know what the word you want to use, Afro-Americans, and I never heard anyone say anything negative about any Afro-American in the environment that I was in. And all of what Baldwin thinks whites are saying about blacks, to my mind, there may be some whites who do think or say such things, but I never encountered any, frankly. And I'm not saying to think I'm blind. No, I think some people imagine that people are saying things about them when in fact they may not be. And I know the environment I am, for instance, he talks about maids in quotes. My Afro-American so-called maid was more close to me than my own mother. And, you know, he thinks that whites think blacks are going to steal the silverware or some stupid thing like that. No one ever imagined such a thing. It was the first thing from anyone's mind. And it's just total stupidity, some of these ideas that he has of the way average whites were thinking. There may be some whites or people of Anglo background that are like that, but they would be that way towards whites or anyone else in their home. It didn't matter what color someone might be who was in their home. If they're suspicious people, they're going to be suspicious of any kind of, whether it's Asian, Hispanic, or Italian, or any other kind of person. So, I mean, all these chimeras that he has in his mind, that he's telling his nephew, I think are stereotypes also. All I can tell you is the people I knew never spoke this way, and in fact, purposely refrained from speaking that way. And I don't know what he's talking about. He believed what whites said about it. I don't know what whites said, maybe redneck Southerners. But I don't know who he's talking about, honestly. And I don't think he knows. So he says here, he believed what white people said about him. What white people is he talking about here? You know, we're living in the North here. So honestly, there may be some whites who are like that. Some ethnic whites of different backgrounds. Maybe there are people from Central European background or other backgrounds who are like that. But I never met any in my whole life and I grew up in the East Coast. And I had never met any who spoke any negative things of this country. So, maybe you have, but I never saw any. And if they thought these things, they certainly didn't voice them very often, that's for sure. And not even as much as the other way around. So again, I'm not making excuses, I'm just trying to say that sometimes, you know, you can cause, the problems are there, no doubt, but you can exacerbate them and make them 10 times worse in your imagination. If you think that, and I don't think that James Baldwin's father was the way he was because he believed what whites said about him. Because I don't think he probably met that many whites that were saying anything about him. So again, this is not a healthy way, to my mind, to face life. And it doesn't help, in fact, if you're from, suppose you came, forget the Afro-American, suppose you came from Taiwan, let's say. You come to America here, you hardly speak very good English, your parents don't speak, or Vietnam or someplace. And then you tell everyone something like 20 years on or something, well, you are the way you are because you believe what whites or Americans or Anglos are saying about you. I think people from an Asian background, from places like Taiwan or Vietnam, don't even think about such things. They don't care what anyone's saying about them. If they are saying anything about them, I don't think people are saying them very much, frankly. But, you know, they just get on with things. And they, you know, try to make their situation better. They help their communities as much as they can. They get up and go forward. They study for their exams. They try to get to colleges and so on. So it's very often your own personal self-image that holds you back in this country. Not always, there are other problems, I grant you, but that doesn't help is what I'm trying to say. If you have a negative self-image of yourself and think all your problems are because of what someone else is doing, then in fact you're going to half defeat yourself, and actually you're serving their purposes. If they want to defeat you, and then you absorb this image, and then you help defeat yourself, you're just doing what they want you to do. So in my mind, that is an extremely unhelpful assessment of the situation. But that's me. You don't have to, because it pains me to see someone recommending these things, even though I think Baldwin is a very smart guy and a very liberated fellow. And in the end, his program is good. So I just want to say that this picture of his father was the way he was because he believed what White said about him. You'll have to evaluate. I don't think that's the right thing to tell your nephew. My father was violent because he was frustrated in life, I think I would say. My wife's father was violent, and he's an Anglo person, Scottish Anglo person. He used to beat his kids and stuff like that. So, I mean, is he violent because he believes what English people are? You know, he's violent because he's weak and he's frustrated. And he doesn't have the mental and spiritual stamina to face the problems of his life. Forgive me. You can respond. So again, Paul was not here to defend it. This is one of the reasons he became so holy. Again, his whole view of this thing is focused on this issue of what whites are thinking. I'm sure your father has told you something of all this. Neither you nor your father exhibit any tendency towards holiness. You're not trying to be ministers. You're what happened when the Negro left the land and came into what the late Franklin Fraser called the cities of destruction. You can be destroyed by believing you really are what the white world calls a nigger. Now look here again. I don't know who's going around calling all blacks by this word. But I heard that word used by Afro-Americans more than I heard any other person ever use it. And in fact, I never heard any Anglo person ever use the word when I was young. You say, well, you lived in a protected area. Yeah, I may have been. But I'm saying, I personally never heard that word used by anybody. So again, I mean, and in fact, Chris Rock has said this in his comedies, and he's one who's faced this very honestly in some of the, how many have seen some of Chris Rock's presentation? You know, he really has laid into some of these things. And so you say, what, are you trying to excuse anything? No, I'm not excusing anything. I'm just saying that that is not going to help your own community to think that is the way other people are behaving. Again, there may be some Southerners who talk like that, and some poor whites who talk in this way in the industrial belt. But I don't think that represents the majority of white people. A lot of you people from Anglo backgrounds in this room, and you'll have to think of your background. Did you ever hear anyone use that term in your household? No. I never did, ever. And I never heard any friend of mine use it. And I never heard any of my parents' friends ever use that word. It was totally non-used. It's been more used recently because of the way people in the rap and other type of environments have thrown it around and made it a more acceptable usage. Again, all I can say is that I don't know who he's talking about. There are people like this, but it's certainly a total stereotype. So again, you can only be destroyed believing what you said, what the white world calls a nigger. Well, the white world doesn't use that word in general. Only a certain part of the white world ever used that word. Perhaps Southern racists did. And no one in the North that I encountered used that word. Now, there were people in the North who did talk like that, I grant you, but those were ethnic communities who had chips on their shoulders too, that were maybe being talked about badly. I don't want to get into ethnic slurs. I know it's known in the Irish world that there were attitudes of this kind because of the competition when the Civil War period came for jobs on the waterfront in places in New Orleans, and that was that became an issue in the race riots in New York City among the Irish areas of America. But they were encountering some of their own problems, and maybe some of the other ethnic groups may have talked like this. Perhaps mafia type people-minded might have spoken of this in this way. But that isn't the rank and file of all Anglo white people by any means. Yeah, I'm not trying to gainsay it totally. What I'm trying to say is that it's an extremely overstatement of what the situation was, and it causes, I think, a reaction that is negative in the person that you're talking to about. So, that one word that he has there, that's how supposedly the whole white world speaks. That is just totally inaccurate. And that's what Malcolm X is saying too. So there are issues here that, now, on the other hand, you can say that we're saying these things in order to wake people up and to make people more conscious of that. And if that's the case, then I think it's a problem. If you care about history too, it's a difficult situation. Anyway, going on here, page 5. I know the world has done to my brother, and narrowly he has survived. And I know, which is much worse, this is a crime which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which I, nor time, nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives, and do not know it and do not want to know it. That may be an accurate statement. And I may be one of the people he's talking about. Do not know it and do not want to know it. So that could be pretty accurate, and that's a more reasonable presentation of what he said previously. So, my namesake, page 6. These innocent and well-meaning people, that could be accurate. Your countrymen have caused you to be born under conditions not very far removed from those described by Charles Dickens. Now, I hear the chorus of the innocent screaming, no, this is not true, how bitter you are. Yes, that's exactly, I guess, what I was just saying here. But I'm writing this letter to you, my nephew. I don't care about them. To try to tell you something about how to handle them. For most of them do not really know that you exist. I know the conditions under which you were born, for I was there. Your countrymen were not there and haven't made it. Your grandmother was also there. I suggest the innocents check with her. She isn't hard to find. Your countrymen don't know that she exists either, though she has been working for them all their lives. He's talking about house person, maid, if you want to call it that, acting like they don't know that she exists. Well, the person that I'm referring to in my life was probably the most important person to me in my youth, so I don't know what he's talking about, but you don't know someone exists. Now, what the conditions of the situation of the environment that she may have faced in her personal life, I don't know. And that may be what he's talking about, which could have been perhaps as negative as he's portraying. In any case, I don't think it was in many ways, but it may have been. There are issues in the Afro-American world too. A lot of things is what part of the South you came from. The person I'm referring to that I knew extremely intimately came from Virginia. And as a Virginian, she had the people that she came from, the people around her had a very high opinion of themselves. They didn't feel inferior in any way, yet they also exhibited racial stereotypes. They had a negative view of people who came from the Deep South, people who came from Alabama or Mississippi or places like that. So in fact, you know, you have these gradations of culture even within the environment that he's speaking about. So some people may have suffered from this mindset more than others. The person I'm referring to had a superior view of herself and the environment that she came from. So again, maybe Baldwin is talking about someone who felt more deprived and more negative about himself. I don't know. So in any case, he said you should check with your grandmother. So he may be right there. That may be in fact true. Remember, 7. I know how black it looks today for you. It looked bad that day too. We have not stopped trembling yet, but if we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. And now you must survive because we love you. You were born into a society which spelled out with brutal clarity, bottom of 7, in as many ways possible that you were a worthless human being. This is tough stuff for anyone to take, again, as an encouragement. And that's why I'm responding to sometimes, he may be right, but I respond somewhat to it because I feel that I'm giving this to you to read, and I don't really feel that I want to make you feel that people think you're a worthless human being. So I feel I have to try to balance. Maybe I'm wrong and I'm too sensitive. But I don't like to purvey material that I think is going to affect someone's mind negatively. when you say people think you're a worthless human being, that may have an effect on your mind and your character and your ability to view yourself and your personality. So again, these are things that I feel sometimes you have to try to also counter as possible. That may be true, and he certainly is bitter. So far it sounds like Malcolm X here, right? And you say, well, why wouldn't he get along with Malcolm X? Well, we're going to see as we go along. There's no reason for you to try to become like white people. There's no basis whatever for their impertinent assumption that they must accept you. Page 80. The terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. That's a very incisive comment. So he's saying to his nephew, look, let's stop this thing that trying to get them to accept you. The real thing is that you've got to accept them. To me, that's the first encouraging thing he said to his nephew. The first upbeat thing that he said. So he does finally get there a little bit. Well, basically, it comes to an end here. And if you and 9, and the word integration means anything, this is what it means. That we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality, and begin to change it. For this is your home, my dear friend. Do not be driven from it. Great men have done great things here. So he does totally turn the table by the end of this. Guys, so I'm just trying to stop the negative balance at the beginning from getting too oppressive for anyone who might be reading it. So in the end, he's saying, look, here, there are great things to be dealt with here. It'll be hard, James. You come from sturdy peasant stock, men who picked cotton, dammed the rivers, built the railroads, and in the teeth of terrifying odds, achieved an unassailable, monumental dignity. You come from a long line of great poets. And so he does, in the end, hit home this positive, I think, reinforcement after the terribly negative start here. We don't want to be pie in the sky. I want to just go back to one thing before we start the next thing here, and that is, what I've always tried to say in my classes is, as far as the Afro-American situation goes, I think he's right there. I think the Afro-Americans should be really amazed at how much has been achieved by their ancestors and who they are and so on in the face of tremendous odds. If you're an American Indian and in the same situation, or Native America, I think the situation is 100 times more bleak, whereas the Native American and Indian population has almost collapsed, if you want to call it that, in the face of what happened in this country. And I don't think anyone meant actually to do it on purpose. It was the clash of civilizations and modern or more technologically advanced society meeting a less technologically advanced society, which always causes tremendously horrific results given the nature of human beings. But when you think of what the population of the Americas were when the whites first came here, about Native Americans, what it finally became, then you see a tremendous destruction occur, I mean, of uncalculable proportions. But if you look at the Afro-American situation, the Afro-Americans basically supplanted the Native Americans in that regard, and the Afro-American has thrived here. So regardless of the situation economically and so on, I mean, the Afro-American has an awful lot to be proud of in terms of the achievements that have occurred and the ability to withstand a situation that wasn't the most positive situation you could have envisioned. And all the successful people that have emerged out of that, particularly more recently. So again, what Baldwin is saying here, I think, is a source of something of pride, not a source of absolute negativity. And, many groups have not fared anywhere near as well. So I think the more people can make that clear to people of that cultural heritage, the happier they will be in developing their own talents and moving forward, rather than feel the the deck is totally stacked against one. I think it's better to look at it in terms of the great achievements that have occurred. Anyways, that's my own personal view of these things. I'm giving you this literature, and I feel responsible for things that are said here. And as a parent, I would never want to say things that are going to hurt my child. Anyway, let me look at this quick before you go. Page 15. Let's give us 5 more minutes here. Let's get into this. I underwent, during the summer that I became 14, a prolonged religious crisis. I used, this is a different essay. I used the word, this is a collection of essays. I used the word religious in common arbitrary sentence, which is why we're looking at this book, because of his religious interest. Meaning I discovered God, his saints, his angels, his blazing hell, and since I had been born into this Christian world, I supposed him to exist only within the walls of the church. So he describes his situation of going through puberty as a young man who experienced the world of the church through his father and basically grew up in the church. I became during my 14th year for the first time in my life afraid of the evil within me, afraid of the evil outside of me. What I saw around me that summer in Harlem was what I'd always seen. But now, without warning, the whores, pimps, racketeers on the avenue become a personal menace. Many of my comrades were clearly headed for the avenue. My father said I was headed there too. My friends began to drink, smoke, embarked on their sexual careers. Girls only slightly older than I sang in the choir, taught in the Sunday school. Children of holy parents underwent before my eyes an incredible metamorphosis. And he describes this extremely well. Something deeper, more subtle in their eyes, their heat, the inflection of their voices, like strangers on the avenue that became in a twinkling of an eye, and utterly different, fantastically present. Matters were not helped by the fact that these holy girls seemed rather to enjoy my terrified lapses, in other words, his sexual feelings that had suddenly awakened. Yet there was something deeper in page 17, less definable, that frightened me. Anyway, he goes on to explain what's happening to his generation. And basically on page 19 he sums it up. My friends were now downtown, busy as they put it, fighting the man. They began to care less about the way they looked, the way they dressed. Presently one found them in 2s, 3s, in hallways, sharing bottles of wine, whiskey, talking, cursing, fighting, lost, unable to say what it was that oppressed them, except it was the man, it was the white man. And there seemed to be no way whatever to remove this cloud that stood between them and the sun. And one did not have to be very bright to realize how little one could do to change one's situation. And he describes some racialist incidents that occurs down in the heart of the city on 42nd Street when people used to go down there. What he's saying here is that at some point everyone grows up and has to go and meet the man. And for him, and that's probably true, this was the white man's world. And so to meet the man produced these terrible negative effects on all of his comrades, his male friends, his female friends. I want to also say, though, in regard to that most people have to meet the man, whatever color you want to make it. Growing up, facing the fact of having to make a living, my kids are still in my house, living off me if they can. I mean, meeting the outside world is a tremendous horror show for most people. So, of course, if you're Afro-American, maybe it is even worse. But nobody likes to go down and meet the man. All of us, unfortunately, have to. That's the capitalist world, and it's a pretty horrific experience people have to go through in order to do this. And if there are strikes against you or issues that make it more difficult, it makes it all that much worse. So, though he's correct, I think he doesn't appreciate, too, that everyone, unfortunately, goes through this to a certain extent. Maybe some have a less horrific time than others at it, but don't think it's just you that has to make the compromises, do what's necessary to hit the pavement and meet the man. One last point. How does he escape from the man? what does he use that is going to get him out of this situation? The crazy thing is, what he uses is the very thing he criticized his father for. It's his golden tongue. It's his religious training. It's the fact that he learned how to be a preacher when he was only a kid that launches him into a tremendously exciting career, even as a teenager, in the black churches that he encounters and is taken into, and then moves him on into the intellectual world of New York and universities and writing and things like that. And it's this training that he's had as a preacher's son that allows him to actually avoid all these things and move into this other huge universe that he finally gets into. Pick up there next time. I'll stop my countering things and try to get through this. You guys start reading it and we'll finish it up